can feel free to continue to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand and we can call on you and have questions from people in the audience.
Well, I'm going to start things off with one of my own questions. Sitting up front here. I wanted to ask both of you, Dr. Grupp, what you think some tangible ways that CHOP can more fully support the commercialization of our own intellectual property so that it can get to patients and make differences in children's lives.
Legal, oh, and legal. So I think that that's we don't have a commercialization mindset, and that's good and bad, by the way. The worst thing that's ever happened to me in the last 10 years is whenever IP peeks into the room, it ruins my life and brings me no good. So yes, for Luxturna, for Kymriah, if a drug company can't get freedom to operate and full control over something, they're not going to commercialize it. So I understand that completely. But the reality is that it brings in complications that only slow things up. So if, there's this Office of Innovation, one of the innovations has to be that we can actually get a MTA in under a year. That would be awesome. So I feel very strongly about, and support Stephen's that, I think we need an action-oriented group of lawyers. I mean, lawyers have two mandates that work at an institution like this. One is protect CHOP, incredibly important, not downing it for a second. And the other is get the agreement done. And so right now the system favors protect CHOP over get the agreement done. And I think that that's a major thing. I think that the other thing that's actually moving in a great direction is the collaborative, the cell and gene therapy collaborative. So how does a investigator who has something cool in the lab drag that out of the lab and start making it? So you're talking about part of that, which is how do you do the IND enabling experiments that allow the FDA to say, hey, you can put that in a patient. And then the next step is how do you actually do the clinical trials that we both talked about. And so for cell and gene therapy, I think the collaborative is really being set up to make that more transparent rather than sort of figuring it out on your own, which is painful. Maybe you disagree. So I think that aspect is extremely positive. I think what you're engaged in is really, really great. I think the cell and gene therapy collaborative is an opportunity for showing people that we're serious about this. Now, I didn't really cover commercialization because that's sort of outside my remit. Here's the thing. From my perspective as an investigator, I could not have been the PI of these trials. And when we started this, I say this with no humility at all, probably the only person who could have done it. Now, there are lots of people that I work with who could have done it, and they're all fantastic. But at the time, there really wasn't anybody. And so if I were involved from any IP perspective, then I could not have been the trial PI. I could have been associated with the trial. They're pretty cool about that, but I couldn't have been the trial PI. So from the perspective of how do I get it to work, you can do one or the other, right? You can participate in the IP or you can run the clinical trial. Those are your choices. So that part of commercialization, the IP part, I'm sure there are people who think that this is great, and surely that's the way you get into a company, and that's really important, and we ought to be commercializing a lot more. But from the perspective of actually getting stuff done, it slows things up considerably.
If I could just add, I think what you're talking about a little bit there, maybe I don't understand, is a conflict of interest, right? With being the trial PI.
Yeah, precisely. Thank you for clarifying.
So I just want to say, there are resources here at CHOP for managing conflict of interest. I don't know if anyone here is part of any of those offices. Feel free to raise your hand. But also a plug for our next session, which will be in June, which is managing conflicts of interest. So stay tuned for the follow-up on that.
There's a fabulous office that does this. And I will say the guy who runs it, Patrick Egan, is just...
He's going to be here on the panel.
The process is horrible, but it is necessarily horrible. Jose Baselga ran afoul of the COA process and it destroyed his career at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and nobody wants that or needs it. And there are many conflicts that are resolvable with a conflict management process, and you'll hear all about it. But there are some conflicts, and participating in the IP is one of them, that are not resolved. Anyway, so thank you for that clarification, and you'll talk all about it next time. So,
Yeah, I would just say that education, of course, is probably the most important, other than legal. Making sure that people know, like with sessions like this one, that there's resources there here at CHOP, and helping people navigate their way through it, because it's certainly not simple, the process, but the resources are here as well.
Great. Yeah, from my perspective, I think just centralizing these efforts as much as possible so there are redundant systems, so that multiple groups aren't trying to come up with a quality assurance unit to meet FDA requirements. There's no need to reinvent the wheel if we can focus all our energies on building centralized resources that have the support to get these things done. That's the biggest.
yeah, I just want to strongly endorse that. I think those of us who've been doing it for a while built our own silos, not because we're silo builders, but because there wasn't a way to do it and we wanted to get it done. But now there are means to do this. There is the collaborative. There is a whole cell-based gene therapy apparatus that exists now. So I think there are people who are ready, willing, and able to jump in. And I agree with that completely. Even though I've built a silo, I'm happy not to have done it.
They're useful structures
Yeah.
in situations, for sure. Okay, so here's a specific one for Sarah. Somebody from the audience, Caitlin Capuano, wants to know how long it took to design, validate, and get approval to proceed with the FDA for the mobility test that you used as an endpoint.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So there was sort of a pilot of the mobility test that started in the phase 1 study of Luxturna. So you talked a little bit about the phases. We did a sort of phase 1/2 trial where we did one eye injection in the phase 1, and the second eye was injected in the phase 2 trial.
Wow.
And there was a sort of pilot mobility course that was in a clinic room, an ophthalmology clinic room. So it was very small. The course we have now is about 5 feet by 10 feet. So, but from that, we sort of refined it and developed it as that trial, as the phase 1/2 trial went on. So, I don't know, 5 years probably. And then we decided that was going to be a good primary outcome measure, but we needed to refine it and standardize it and validate it. So I would say with the validation study and sort of the beginning processes in the phase 1 to probably about 10 years, really develop that endpoint.
Not an easy accomplishment.
Not easy, no.
For
No.
sure. Yeah, and I'm sure constant communication with the FDA was required. I think that's a theme that I would stress in all of these situations. As we said, every test article is a little bit different, but a key point is to have an open line of communication with the FDA so that you know you're not wasting your time and energy on things that they won't approve or won't accept.
And I would agree with that 100% and say that it's like everything else in the world, really reviewer dependent.
Yes.
So you need to get and if sometimes the reviewer changes, it's like, there's nothing you can do about that. But I mean, in the end, just because the FDA says X doesn't mean that they aren't going to say Y later. But it helps so much to at least have heard X, because often what you think is going to be fine is not what they actually want to see.
It's a document. So to have documentation to go back on. And kind of in the same vein, another question for both of you. There's about 4 programs by the FDA for fast tracking approvals, one of which is called the Breakthrough Therapy Designation. And both of the drugs that you talked about today received breakthrough designation. Can you talk a little bit about what that designation did for you and how it helped bring these therapies to patients quicker?
Yeah, I mean, breakthrough designation, I think, is critical for these important diseases to reach patients, particularly for the sponsor, of course, because the designation helps the industry sponsor the most because it speeds up all of the reviews, but that trickles down and it speeds up everything at the site as well. But I think it's really important for these therapies to get them out to patients.
Yeah, I agree 100%. things that have transformative effects and are brand new are the things that they want to target with breakthrough therapy designation. It does feel like things move a lot faster under those circumstances. There are regulatory implications that I don't understand, but gets you to the finish line more quickly. I think there is also an intent for the process of going from a BLA submission to your PDUFA date to be faster. And so in general, the goal, and I don't understand a lot of the regulatory processes here because they are at a sponsor level, but both Penn, who owned the therapy before they licensed it to Novartis, and Novartis got breakthrough therapy for this. And I think it helped the development to Novartis, and then it clearly sped the development post Novartis, and was a big reason why we got from 2012 to 2017 with FDA approval. So, and these are ultra orphan diseases or diseases with no useful treatments. And I think a key point is how many people were on the phase 1/2 trial? 12. Yeah. So not a lot of things get approved with 12 patients. So the Eliana trial that we initially submitted, had no control arm at all. I mean, you had a control eye. You can't treat half the body. So I think that's really cool.
Yes, yeah.
But we didn't have that. So this is not a randomized trial. Everybody got the test article. We compared it against a 20% likelihood of going into remission, which was sort of the drug standard of the time. FDA was cool with that endpoint. That's a key thing. And then we did this phase 2 trial that was the thing that actually they approved on that trial, the CR rate was 82%, and they were like, oh, that sounds pretty good. And I have to say, when we reviewed this, there are significant toxicities associated with CAR T that I didn't get into at all, and significant. 12% of the patients that we treat go to the ICU. It used to be 40. So really significant, but we know how to control them. They spend an average of 8 days in the ICU. We've not lost a single patient on that trial to cytokine release syndrome, which is the toxicity. But the FDA made the message very clear when we went for that advisory committee. They say, we believe it works. Of course, we spent all the time on that, but show us that it's safe. Not an issue for your stuff, I imagine. Is it with that safety an issue?
Safety, less so, because the ocular injection, it remains. But there were some safety concerns.
Okay. Were there inflammatory complications? I wish I knew more about this.
Yeah, there was one patient that did have an inflammatory response. Most likely, they attributed it to a steroid that was used to treat inflammation.
Oh, okay.
He had a decrease in visual acuity.
And this concept of a phase 1/2A study, I mean, so the study that we treated Emily Whitehead on was a phase 1/2A study. And what that really means is that we intended to treat 12 patients on that study and ended up treating 72. Because basically what happened is we said, holy something, it works. And then it was like, okay, how do we, in addition to, we want to get to the scientific endpoint, in addition to, we want to understand safety, in addition to, we want to be able to transfer this technology to Novartis so they can get it FDA approved. We're like, we want to treat as many patients as we can because there's no other ship for these patients. And I would say that we're also the last stop for these patients because there isn't much beyond what we do to help them. And at the time, there was nothing. And so we were really interested in that, this is the CHOP part of there was no scientific reason to treat that many patients. It's just we wanted them to be alive. And somehow we got away with that.
Worked out well for Emily, for sure. So there's one more question coming in from the online group. The question is, does the drug ever come out of phase 4? So this is the post-market monitoring phase of therapeutics. And I'll be completely honest, I don't know the correct answer. I know some drugs stay in phase 4 for decades, but I think it's kind of dependent on the FDA response. So I can't give a definitive answer. It's unique for every drug. Certainly not up to any of us.
So I guess for Kymriah, the post-marketing requirement is 2,500 patients, of which they've acquired probably about 2,000. Unless there's a safety event, this gets back to exactly what you're saying, that makes them want to look longer and more patients, that will stop. There's also for a lot of these, what's called the REMS, where they actually look at, enforce a system for taking care of the patients safely. And so I don't know, does Luxturna have a REMS? Okay, well, Kymriah has a REMS, which is like, don't do this if you don't know what you're doing. And so a lot of the these products that have more of a toxicity profile will have that risk evaluation and mitigation system that is something that is not a phase 4 study, but something that the FDA is expected to monitor forever. And then the other thing that can happen in a phase 4 circumstance is the drug can be pulled back. So the FDA can say, well, we approved it, but now we're seeing stuff we don't like very much. We see toxicity. We don't see the efficacy that we thought. We had an understanding that it was putting patients into remission this amount of time, and now it's not doing a third of that. So maybe we're going to reevaluate that. And you're seeing with the Aduhelm, with the Alzheimer's drug, that is heading toward that. There was a drug for AML that went through this process, was put on the market, used extensively, pretty good in peds, not as good in adults, got pulled off the market because the efficacy wasn't good enough, and now is working its way back onto the market. That was gemtuzumab. So these things can go back and forth depending on what happens. And sometimes what ends up happening is you then have to go back to a research study and convince the FDA that it was actually not as bad as they thought, and then they can see that data and they can reevaluate their decision not to keep